Some look through this prism over and over and over and over. OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, is an anxiety disorder that is categorized by recurrent, unwanted thoughts, obsessions, and/or repetitive behaviors. It's estimated that slightly over 2% of adults between the ages of 18 and 54 suffer from this disorder in the United States. And that's a higher percentage than those afflicted with conditions such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Now, a new study may have found a switch in the brain that causes repetitive behaviors in mice to start and stop. Scientists are hoping that this could lead to an understanding of OCD and a way to reduce its symptoms. Here to tell us more is psychiatrist Scott Rauch. He's with McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. Welcome, Dr. Rauch.
Well, thanks very much for having me with you today. Indeed, this is really very exciting science. As you indicated, obsessive compulsive disorder is a very common disorder, and there are currently treatments that are relatively effective, both medication treatments and also cognitive and behavior therapy talking treatments. But it's the case that, more often than not, patients are left with residual symptoms. Some patients don't respond at all to currently available treatments, and many of them are left impaired. So clearly it's a major public health problem, and so it really represents a great opportunity for the field if we can advance our understanding of the underlying brain basis of these disorders. I should say that, really research over the last 2 decades in humans using brain imaging has indicated in a fairly convergent way broadly what brain circuits are involved in the disease. The problem, though, with research of that kind is that it's really correlational. We see what's going on in the brain of people with the disease, but we don't know for sure what apparent abnormalities really represent sort of the cause or the underlying sort of mediating anatomy of the disease versus sort of secondary abnormalities in the behavior of the brain. And so it's really a perfect example of where translational neuroscience can have a huge impact. That is where studies, for instance, in animals may allow investigators to, in essence, cause obsessive-compulsive behavior. I think it's also really important to realize that while both of these exciting papers spoke about OCD, that in some ways, more appropriately, what both are modeling is pathological compulsive behavior. And in fact, compulsive behaviors are present across a wide variety of psychiatric illnesses. OCD is the one that often people think of first, sort of for obvious reasons. It's right in the name. But in fact, compulsive behavior, that is repetitive behaviors that are done in sort of a ritualized fashion, are really very prominent aspects of autism spectrum disorders, of addictions, of a wide variety of obsessive-compulsive related disorders like trichotillomania, that's hair pulling, body dysmorphic disorder, and so a range of other disorders. In both of these studies, they really modeled pathological compulsive behaviors, that is, repetitive behaviors. So one of the studies, the one done by Mari and her colleagues at Columbia University, what they did was they used a revolutionary technique called optogenetics to, in essence, cause pathological compulsive behaviors. What optogenetics does is it introduces into cells sort of a light-sensitive factor so that when you shine light into the brain, you can make a certain subset of brain cells fire. And so what they did is through optogenetics, they made a particular brain circuit from a brain region called orbitofrontal cortex into the striatum. Orbitofrontal cortex is sort of the part of your brain in the frontal cortex that's right above your eyes that projects deep into the brain, the striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia. And what they showed was that when they stimulated that area repeatedly over about 5 days' time, that gradually the mice began to exhibit these compulsive grooming behaviors. And part of what's interesting is that even after they stopped the stimulation, those compulsive behaviors continued for up to 2 weeks afterwards. So very important that So this circuitry from orbitofrontal cortex to striatum that had been implicated in human brain imaging studies as a basis for OCD, in mice, when in a very refined way using optogenetics, they could stimulate those tracts. When they did it repeatedly, the grooming didn't start right away, but over time, through plastic change, the animals began to exhibit these sort of pathologically compulsive grooming behaviors.
So in that sense, it sounds like that the laser, which is stimulating that part of the brain, is very much not like the hammer that a doctor uses on your knee to get a reflex response. So it is doing something slightly more complex, right?
That's exactly right, because it's not as if as soon as the stimulation goes on, the compulsion starts immediately. So it's not like it's being driven in that reflexive way, really just as you described. Part of what makes their study particularly exciting, first it's this sort of plastic element that it's repeated stimulation over time that then causes the compulsivity, and then even after they stop the stimulation, it continues on for a period of time, so that's leading to some sort of plastic change. Also, what makes the model especially compelling is that they then also looked at what happened to the behavior when it was treated with fluoxetine or a serotonergic reuptake inhibitor, which is the kind of medication that is particularly effective for treating OCD and other compulsive behaviors. And in fact, what they found was that when they gave the medication, over time, the compulsive behavior stopped. So that this optogenetic repeated stimulation model of pathological compulsivity was sort of validated in a way by not only having some of the appearance of pathological compulsions, but also being responsive to fluoxetine as compulsivity is.
One of the things that I found interesting in this was that when they treated the mice with the laser, it apparently elicited this one response, this grooming response. Does that seem to indicate that compulsive behaviors have a wide ranges of fuse box which need to be flipped? Or is there this one sort of localized region of the brain which, if we treat that, it'll deal with all sorts of compulsive behavior simultaneously?
Yeah, it's really a great question. So, it gives me the opportunity to just sort of emphasize that in the case of obsessive compulsive disorder, there are really a wide variety of different signs and symptoms that are seen. So, there are some people with OCD who have the obsessions, that is, the intrusive thoughts about contamination, and often their repetitive behaviors will be, such as washing or other grooming behaviors. And then there are others who have doubting obsessions and checking compulsions, and still others who have sort of horrific, taboo, intrusive thoughts, who might have a whole range of different ritualistic behaviors to sort of neutralize the associated anxiety. So there's a wide variety of different sort of types of OCD or types of ritualistic behavior. And we don't really know how that heterogeneity in the symptoms maps on to different brain bases. It could be that it's essentially the same brain basis for those different sort of flavors of OCD, or it could be that sort of the circuit dysregulation is more specific in some way to those specific types of disorders. So certainly in other research in OCD, the brain imaging research and otherwise, investigators have often sought, but not so readily found, differences between contamination OCD versus checking OCD versus sort of taboo thoughts or pure obsession OCD. So, I think that really remains to be seen. In actually both this tandem of studies, the principal type of repetitive behavior that was seen was sort of grooming related. And we certainly know that in rodents, there's a ritualistic behavior that is somewhat more readily induced than some other repetitive behaviors.
I want to ask you a little bit about conditioning, just because I'm wondering if it's possible the laser goes into this part of the brain and eventually a grooming behavior happens. Could it be that the laser is causing a reward function? The mouse is responding to that eventually, that he realizes, hey, wait a minute, an endorphin's been released, a positive chemical's been released. Maybe I should keep doing this sucker. And we're not triggering a compulsive reaction, we've just triggered a reward system.
I think it would be difficult to make the argument that the optogenetic stimulation here was simply providing reward. If that were the case, to some degree, it would have to be in tandem with the animal already spontaneously showing grooming. And then I imagine that if you rewarded a specific behavior repeatedly, but only that behavior, you could get a higher frequency of that behavior. And it's interesting in phenomenologic models of OCD, this whole issue of what is really sort of the basis of the way the compulsion matches the obsession. Is it that when the individual washes, it reduces their anxiety, and that reduction in anxiety is providing sort of a reward-like factor that then pulls for a higher frequency of the behavior. So, there are some cases of OCD where it appears that the repetitive behavior is reducing an unwanted state, like anxiety. Others, such as addiction, where some of the ritualistic behaviors are tied to more rewarding acts. But really, in this particular model, I think it's hard to make that argument because in some ways, it's the repeated optogenetic stimulation that is, in essence, generating the repetitive behavior as well as maintaining it over time.
And so since we didn't have that Pavlovian bell and the immediate response, it probably isn't that. Want to move on to humans and whether or not what we're seeing in here may be generalizable in the future. Do you think that this is something which is going to possibly give us a step astride or a leap?
Really, the most exciting thing about both studies, and we've not yet spoken about the second, is that really what the optogenetics does is two things. One is, in the animal research, it really provides an opportunity to actively manipulate the brain activity, as opposed to just watching what's happening. The investigators are actually manipulating the brain activity. But the other thing, and this is what really makes it, I think, more of a leap than a baby step, is that the way the optogenetic transfection works is that you're really identifying and manipulating a discrete subset of cells. Already, both in human experimental treatments for OCD as well as research in animals, we can stimulate the brain. We can stimulate the brain electrically through deep brain stimulation. But when we do that, we are stimulating, in essence, a very heterogeneous group of cells in a given spatial location. What's very cool about optogenetics is you're really targeting a specific cell type for activation. And so the circuitry knowledge that's gained in both of these studies has to do with the fact that they're introducing the optogenetic stimulation for a very discrete subset of cells. So again, in the Amari paper, they're doing that in orbitofrontal cortex with specific projections to striatum. And in stimulating those, they are, in essence, causing the compulsive behavior. In the Berger study, what they've done is they've taken SAPAP3 mice, which are genetically modified mice with a structural abnormality in the striatum, who already show compulsive grooming behaviors. And what they've done in this case is they've introduced the optogenetic intervention in a way where they're stimulating a subset of cells that inhibit a certain kind of activity in the striatum. And in so doing, they show a decrease in the pathologically compulsive behaviors. So again, I guess what I just want to emphasize is the elegance of this tandem of studies is that in one, a very selective group of cells in a circuit are being activated to cause compulsive behavior, and in another, a very specific set of cells are being activated to neutralize, really terminate pathologically compulsive behaviors.
Using optogenetics to look through the prism on the Voice of Russia. I'm Andrew Hiller, and we've been speaking with psychiatrist Scott Rauch. He's with the McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. Thank you so much for the insight.
Thank you.